Welcome to Aaron Mahnke's Cabinet of Curiosities, a production of iHeartRadio and Grim and Mild.
Our world is full of the unexplainable. And if history is an open book, all of these amazing tales are right there on display, just waiting for us to explore. Welcome to the Cabinet of Curiosities. Ada Lovelace had always been someone who threw herself into her hobbies. As an aristocratic young woman in 17th century England, it was all she really could do. Many of her friends found passion in the few pastimes deemed ladylike enough for them, like embroidery, music, and writing poetry. But Ada had a significantly different pastime: advanced mathematics. She came by it honestly. Her mother, Annabella, was an amateur mathematician herself, and her father, Lord Byron, was one of the most famous poets and intellectuals of his time. Just as famous was his reputation for debauchery, thrill-seeking, and his strong will, which led Annabella to separate from him when Ada was just a year old. Fearing her daughter would inherit what she called Lord Byron's madness, Annabella insisted Ada fill her brain instead with languages, classic literature, science, and mathematics. And these latter subjects were always Ada's favorite. She would doodle designs for flying machines in her workbooks and ask insightful questions about the science of everyday phenomena like rainbows. Ada's interest in math took a turn from hobbyist to professional when she attended a party in 1832 at the age of 17. The host, a man named Charles, showed Ada and her mother his latest invention, a steam-powered math machine. Now, at the time, to solve any sort of complex calculations, you would have to write them out by hand or use a rudimentary tool like an abacus. The thinking machine, as Ada called it, was impressive. It was able to raise numbers to the second and third power and add and subtract numbers quickly. Ada was fascinated, and she and Charles became instant friends. For the next decade, the two exchanged hundreds of letters debating mathematic principles. Charles quickly took to bouncing ideas off of Ada for his newest invention, an even more complicated calculator. Charles envisioned the machine would use a series of punched cards to represent different mathematical values, which a person would input manually. This machine would be able to solve formulas, find square roots, and perform even more complex calculations. Ada had been keeping busy for several years in the 1830s by marrying and giving birth to her 3 children. But by 1840, she wanted to put her mind back to work, helping her old friend Charles. The British scientific community had turned its nose up at his new calculating machine, so he had gone to the continent to raise funds for its development. In Europe, a fan of Charles had published Charles's lecture notes in French, and this, Ada realized, was her opportunity. She would translate the notes to English and publish them in Britain. Charles agreed on one condition: that Ada would publish her annotations alongside. The ideas in Ada's notes stretched beyond the bounds of what Charles had created. Charles had originally envisioned his machine as merely a mathematical tool. It was Ada who realized that they could use it for other data. The most logical use was for algebraic formulas, not just arithmetic as Charles' first machine did. In her notes, she also mused about replacing the numbers for symbols and notes, envisioning a future where his machine could write music or even generate images. In her final note, titled Note G, Ada described how in detail to perform a specific calculation. She provided step-by-step instructions for how to arrange the cards in the machine for it to produce the Bernoulli numbers, a specific sequence of rational numbers. When Ada's final translation was published in 1843, that work was 66 pages long, 41 of which were Ada's notes. All told, Charles' machine was never created in real life. It remained theoretical. Therefore, it wasn't until nearly 100 years later that the scientific community realized the full impact of what he and Ada had done. You see, Ada's friend Charles was none other than Charles Babbage, the celebrated English polymath. His invention, the analytical engine, is considered today to be the first general-purpose computer, which is impressive, but almost pales in comparison to what Ada did. You see, if the analytical engine was a computer, that means that Ada Lovelace's detailed instructions for calculating Bernoulli numbers was the world's first computer program, written almost 100 years before the term computer ever existed. Outside of George Washington, baseball games, and apple pie, there are very few things more American than a good old-fashioned UFO sighting. The United States leads the world in flying saucer encounters with over 105,000 reported sightings since 1947. That, of course, is the year that a mysterious aircraft crashed near an Army airfield in Roswell, New Mexico. The government rushed to collect the debris and cover up the incident, sparking conspiracy theories that the downed aircraft was extraterrestrial in nature. We now know that it wasn't the case. If you believe the official story, the aircraft was actually part of Project Mogul, a top-secret balloon project designed by the military to spy on Soviet nuclear tests. But that wasn't revealed until 1994, and in the decades between, UFO sightings really took off. But while Roswell is often cited as the start of America's infatuation with UFOs, it's not actually the first sighting on record. There are at least two others that precede it. One occurred in the same year as the Roswell crash. In June of that year, an amateur pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier in Washington when he saw 9 crescent-shaped objects darting through the sky. He told journalists that the craft were incredibly fast, moving hundreds of thousands of miles per hour. They moved like saucers skipping on water. The other sighting is a bit older, and in some ways, even stranger. It happened to a man named James Everell and 2 of his friends. The trio were rowing across the Charles River one night when they saw an incredible light zipping across the sky. Their description is eerily similar to what Arnold's experienced in 1947. For close to 3 hours, the light darted back and forth between the river and nearby Charleston. At times, it would stand completely still in the sky, pulsing vibrantly before it started to move again. When the light finally faded away, Everell and his friends were startled to discover that they had traveled a mile upriver. They had no memory of how they'd gotten there, which is especially strange since they moved against the tide, meaning that they couldn't have just drifted. It was like the light had transported them in an instant, or like they'd briefly blacked out and forgotten part of their experience. If that's what happens, it aligns with countless other alien abduction stories from later years. The most famous is probably the case of Betty and Barney Hill. The couple was driving through New Hampshire's White Mountains in 1961 when they saw a strange light in the sky that seemed to be following them. The next thing they knew, it was dawn, and they were pulling up in front of their house. They couldn't remember what had happened with the lights, but their clothes were torn and dirty. It was only through hypnosis that they eventually recovered traumatic memories of what had happened. For the rest of their lives, the Hills maintained that they had been abducted and forcibly examined by aliens. James Everell never underwent hypnosis treatment, so we have no way of knowing what happened during the time that he lost. He never claimed to have been abducted, nor did he identify the lights he saw over the Charles River as a UFO. But it's an interesting case for a few reasons. The lights were verified by several other witnesses in Charleston, and the local governor, John Winthrop, personally recorded James Everell's account. Unlike the Roswell incident, it's highly unlikely that the lights he saw that night were from a military aircraft or balloon, because this sighting occurred well before planes or weather balloons, or even the U.S. government existed. It happened on March 1st of 1639, less than 20 years after the first Thanksgiving. James Everell and his companions were Puritan settlers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Which means that whatever's causing all those lights in the sky, they've been here for a very long time. We've been seeing them since the Pilgrims stepped off of the Mayflower. I hope you've enjoyed today's guided tour of the Cabinet of Curiosities. Subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts or learn more about the show by visiting curiositiespodcast.com. This show was created by me, Aaron Mahnke, in partnership with How Stuff Works. I make another award-winning show called Lore, which is a podcast, book series, and television show, and you can learn all about it over at theworldoflore.com. And until next time, stay curious.